Okay, it looks like everyone is filtering in, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for we're going to be having a wide-ranging discussion about what's happening in Israel right now related to the judicial overhaul, as well as more specifically what is happening tomorrow at the Israeli Supreme Court. So tomorrow, the Israeli Supreme Court will be hearing petitions against the Knesset striking down the court's reasonableness doctrine, which is a judicial tool that allows the court to review government decisions it viewed as the name implies, unreasonable or arbitrary. It's so far the only piece of the judicial overhaul that the current Netanyahu government has managed to pass. Proponents of the package argue that this particular change is necessary to curb the power of an overactive judiciary, who often does so for political purposes, while opponents say the reasonableness standard is one of the few checks on the executive and the Knesset, and threatens Israel's democratic character. Tomorrow, in a rare turn of events in Israel, the full 15-member High Court justices will hear the petitions, although a decision is still probably a long ways off. And as we're entering the 36th week of protests that have brought a broad spectrum of Israelis to the streets, the Israeli press has also reported that Netanyahu may either be seeking a unilateral softening of the proposal or refuse to obey the court's ruling, which could trigger a constitutional crisis. So, what will happen next? What are the stakes? And what are, more importantly, experts watching as history unfolds in real time? Today, I'm really grateful to be joined by two brilliant author and the Court Distinguished Fellow at Shalom College, as well as Dahlia Scheindlin, a self-described recovering strategist, pollster, and a co-founder of Plus 972 magazine. I often turn to each of them when I think through thorny political and moral issues, and I'm sure each of you will be challenged and enlightened by their perspectives as well. And as we get started with the conversation, you should see a button for Q&A in the chat. If you have questions, please feel free to put them there, and we'll be monitoring them through the conversation. So to begin, ask each of the speakers to answer in about 5 minutes if they can, starting with Daniel. What's at stake in tomorrow's Supreme Court hearing? And more broadly, how far are both judicial reform proponents and protesters from accomplishing their specific goals or agreeing to a compromise?
It's a great question. First of all, Laura, thank you for having me. Dahlia and I have done stuff together before. You and I have done stuff together, so it's nice to bring the three of us together, and an honor to do this. The question is really a very important one, and it kind of depends which opponents and which proponents. There are people, of course, on the opponent side who will be satisfied with nothing less than the collapse of the Netanyahu government. And if you go to the protests every week, as I do, I assume that Dahlia has been to a bunch. I don't know if you go every week, but there's this chant that, at least in the Jerusalem protests, if there's not equality, which means if you get anything through, we're going to bring the government down, and you kind of took on the wrong generation. There are a lot of those people out there, and one of the dangers that I think lies between us and some compromise is a very hardened, not radical, actually probably pretty centrist side of the opponents who are so sick of this that they're not going to be satisfied with anything other than actually bringing the government down. They are pretty far from their goals. The government may bring itself down. Bibi got into a kerfuffle yesterday with a Haredim over a comment that he made, which was actually accidentally totally innocuous. He said nothing wrong this particular time, but he said, if you go to Oman, God might not protect you, because God hasn't always protected the Jews of Europe, which is pretty obviously true. But it caused a whole ruckus. The government could fall for a whole array of reasons, the draft bill, a whole array of things. But if you're on the part that wants Bibi's government out, you're not very close to your goals. If you are part of the resistance that wants the judicial process, reform process slowed down, or maybe after reasonability tabled, you may be fairly close to getting what you wanted because they have gotten much less through than they anticipated. It's not clear that the court will, go yes or no on this. They may do something much more in the middle, in which case there may be some reasonability test change, but not a complete denial. So what everybody calls the left, but is really not the left. It's the left, the center, and part of the right. It's the opponents of, and again, nomenclature is important. It's not really judicial reform, it's judicial coup. I think it's actually a fairer way of putting it because it changes the ground rules. So most of the people, I think, who are opposed to the judicial change, let's just be, kind of non-judgmental about it at the moment. If what they wanted was to slow this thing down dramatically, they've won, and they may actually get some more progress very soon. On the other side, the people that are in favor of reform, those people who are like Yariv Levin and Simcha Rothman and so forth, who brought in a whole package, they are light years away from what they wanted. They have basically been stymied. Nobody in the coalition expected this kind of response. A political scientist in Israel that I listened to this week said that this is actually now the longest running anti-government protest in the history of the West. So I don't know that that's true because that's not my field, but he said so. Seemed like a very smart guy. And so they're nowhere. I mean, and they're now talking, even just today, about an hour ago, Smotrich said, Shikma Bressler, who's one of the leaders of the protest movement, Shikma Bressler called me a Nazi the other day, which she sort of did. But I'm still willing to compromise, meaning that he probably understands that Bibi is getting very ready to make a compromise here. So the people on the right who wanted the full package, they are very, very far away from getting what they want. The people who would be satisfied with some progress got a very little bit, but not nearly what they thought. And they may have to compromise on everything else being tabled. So we're actually kind of in the middle, which is really sort of where you would want to be as a society. Everybody could claim a little bit of victory. Everybody could claim some disappointment. Obviously, I think this has been very destructive to Israeli society as a whole. Yet what it has done is it has galvanized, I think, a long sleeping giant. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people here who care deeply about Israel, who care deeply about its Jewishness and its democratic nature, who have woken up, who are no longer going to be as politically nonchalant as they were. And what this means for Israeli politics really remains to be seen.
Is that my cue?
I think Laura may have frozen, but
yeah, Laura froze for a second.
Hopefully I'm back, but yes, Dahlia.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you also for inviting me, and thank you to everybody who's attending. And Daniel, thanks for that great opening, because I think we shockingly managed to leave slightly different areas to focus on. I would say that what's at stake here, when I think about it, is the entire fate of Israel's tenuous democratic institutions collapsing into the void of its missing pillars. Only slightly kidding, but not really. Let me just back up for a moment and say that, for those who don't know the reasonability doctrine that well, because in the US it's not as common, you don't need it as much. We have a formal written constitution in the US. It is drawn from British law. It's used in some other countries like Canada and the UK today. And I just want to clarify what it relates to. It does not relate to the Supreme Court judging legislation. It's administrative law, and it only relates to executive action. So what this does mean is that the court has lost a standard by which it can judge the reasonability of executive action. It does not, however, relate to the court's ability to rule on legislation, which is important. And it's very important to make sense of these things, something that our elected leaders have not always taken the time to do because they've made that mistake themselves. But in any case, once the elected leaders learned what they were actually trying to propose, they have said, well, the reasonability doctrine isn't really used that much on its own as a standard for judging cases, for judging executive action. So it's really not such a big deal that we passed this amendment to Israel's basic laws. I say it is a big deal. And I want to argue 3 points about why, 3, 4, depending on how you count. I think the main thing to understand is that the kinds of cases, and there aren't that many, that have been judged primarily, even if not exclusively, on the reasonability standard, really relate to government appointments. That means that the government can appoint any figure, really, but particularly we're looking at gatekeepers, legal advisors. As you may know, the name of the Attorney General in Israel is formally the legal advisor to the government, or any other political appointee, and also legal advisors to ministers. that can also relate to the dismissal of those figures, so that essentially the government can now stack both the ministries and the civil service, to be honest, with loyalists, replace professional appointees with loyalist political appointees, and advance its whatever policies it wants. It also makes the government much more friendly, and the particular cases we've seen are when the government has wanted to appoint people who have either been indicted or convicted of corruption. So some legal scholars think this is basically an opening for government corruption. The government would argue that it's not such a big deal because the law was softened in the committee work because of the protests, and now only relates to decisions by the prime minister and the ministers themselves rather than all layers of government. But that is a moot point, because Israel's basic law of the government also has an article that says that the ministers can appropriate for themselves pretty much any level of appointment or competencies within their ministry. So this really shouldn't be misunderstood. It can affect the entire government at all levels. So that's sort of, I would say that, the second main takeaway I want you to understand is that this does essentially remove one of the few checks and balances on executive action in Israel. And that's the main thing that always has to be kept in mind when we're looking at this judicial reform, is that Israel lacks most of the standard institutional checks and balances on executive power that you would see in a democracy, including parliamentary democracies, where the executive is drawn from a majority of the legislature. But Israel doesn't have any of the other normal checks and constraints on government power. So I think that's a main thing to keep in mind. And the other thing is that we should also remember that this will affect government action everywhere the government rules, which, as everybody knows, is not only a matter of ruling Israeli citizens, but it's ruling non-citizens, particularly in the occupied territories and in the West Bank. And that's something that is generally a little bit, I would say ambiguous, because we don't really think of this as directly connected to the occupation. But when you think of the fact that for the most part, the lives of Palestinians are governed by Israel's executive power, primarily the occupation is supposed to be run through the defense ministry and the army, which is changing under this government. But still, there have been cases where reasonability has been used as a reason for trying to challenge government action with relation to the occupied territories, but also going back to that first point, that the government can simply do what it wants with relation to its plans without legal constraints, or this particular legal constraint. And that includes all of the aims of this government, which are very openly the aims of annexation and theocracy and privileging or supremacy of the Jewish population. So in terms of the stakes, I think that we also, okay, let me put that aside, because those are the stakes for how the Israeli government can govern. Specifically with relation to what's happening tomorrow, we have to keep in mind that this is all very self-referential. The arguments tomorrow are being turned into, an enormous fight over the role of the Israeli Supreme Court. For many years now, but particularly over the last couple of years, the Israeli government and all of the right-wing leaders, I would say, or let's say far right-wing leaders, have been attacking the Supreme Court on numerous grounds. But one of them is that the Supreme Court should never be hearing cases about basic laws, let alone overturning or possibly intervening in an amendment to a basic law. Elected ministers have been, frankly, openly threatening the Supreme Court, basically saying, don't you dare rule against it. The rhetoric is getting pretty ugly. I know I'm probably running out of time, so I just want to make one comment about who is advancing in their goals. And I pretty much agree with Daniel that the protest has had a major success, of course, by it basically killing the plan as a whole in its extreme and original version. So that's been, very heady victory, but it's not a complete victory because, as I said before, there are no institutional constraints on that parliamentary majority. So, the constraint is only in terms of whatever force, whatever power the protest can bring to it. The other thing is that the right-wing, government has essentially passed this law. It passed another law that's not necessarily considered part of the judicial overhaul, but reinforces or protects the position of the prime minister. That's another case that's going to be reaching the Supreme Court later this month. So they're passing every little, splinter of it as much as they can. And I would say that, on the other hand, the far right leadership that's been attacking the judiciary over the years has seen an enormous blow, not only in stopping this, the whole package as it was originally proposed, but the fact is that ever since January, every single survey has shown that not only are a majority of Israelis against this plan, but at least half, if not more, people who voted for this coalition have been against the government's plans. And that is a remarkable situation, considering that for the last 15 years, there have been, frankly, oceans of money poured into a whole range of actors who, from think tanks like Kohelet, but other actors as well. Like, let's count within that Israel Today, the Freebie magazine, which has changed its tune a little bit, but have been, agitating for these attacks on the judiciary for years. And all of that campaigning that seemed to come out of every corner for the last decade at least has essentially gone down the drain because the public has shown with a very, very clear majority that they're against these particular plans. I'll stop here for now.
So there's obviously a lot of differences, to put it lightly, between the American and Israeli political systems. And one of those huge differences is obviously that Israel does not have a constitution. But the phrase constitutional crisis is used a lot when discussing the stakes of this issue, particularly as we're looking to reports that Netanyahu may not abide by the court's ruling if it does end up siding against overturning the reasonableness standard. So, Daniel, what does it actually mean to have a constitutional crisis in the absence of a constitution?
What it means is it's not clear who runs the country. That's the bottom line. It's not clear who's in charge. Because if the Supreme Court strikes down the Knesset's law, the Knesset's undoing of the reasonability test, then what's going to happen is the court's going to say you don't have the right to do that because it's infringing on a basic law, and we're overruling it. Judicial review, the law's unconstitutional, so to speak, even though we don't have a constitution. And the government, some people in the government, many have threatened that if you do that, we're just ignoring the court. And then it's really not clear who decides what, by the way. And it's not only a matter of who decides things about whether a law is quote unquote constitutional or not. Everybody's also watching very closely here what's happening with the Iranian scene and the Lebanese border right now. They're all heating up. So the head of the Mossad actually gave a speech yesterday in which he pretty much warned Iran that Israel was going to take unprecedented action. Now, that was either directed at the Iranians or at the Americans, whoever it was directed at, but Israel's heating up the rhetoric because Iran has been heating up the territory. Today, Israel announced that Iran has built an Air Force base 20 kilometers from Israel's northern border, which is obviously untenable, and it can't be allowed to stay there. So while this is all happening, what does this have to do with that? Let's just say, and anybody has standing in the Israeli Supreme Court. So if Dahlia wants to go and just bring a case saying that the army should not patrol between whatever hours outside Metula, it may or may not be a strong argument, but she has the legal right to go. You don't need to be a party to a suit like you do in America. You don't have to be a party to a case. So if the border heats up and Israel starts to do things and it calls up soldiers or it takes military action, anybody could theoretically, for example, go to the Supreme Court and say, we don't want this. We think this should happen, should not happen, whatever the Supreme Court rules. Then Netanyahu says, no, actually, the Supreme Court doesn't get to control. I control. Supreme Court says, no, Netanyahu, you don't control, we control. Who does Gallant, who's the defense minister, actually report to? Does he listen to the Supreme Court or does he listen to the government? Who do the police listen to or report to? In other words, at a certain point, what this means is when people are threatening not to follow the court's ruling, what they're saying is it's going to be fundamentally unclear who at the end of the day is in charge of this country. And that obviously is an entirely untenable situation. Now, there's a lot to say about this. I want to keep this brief, but I'll just say that I think that it's very important to note that all of the major institutions in this country have come out very firmly, and I think appropriately, and said that they are going to side with the court. The Mossad has said it's going to side with the court. The army has said it's going to side with the court. The police have said they're going to side with the court. The Shin Bet has said they're going to side with the court. Obviously, the Bar Association has said it's going to side with the court, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which is one of the reasons that Netanyahu has a whole array of reasons not to want this to go to court tomorrow. He actually has a lot of incentive to try to solve this, as they say in Washington, D.C., to solve it on the steps of the Supreme Court. Before you go in, just let's make a deal right now and we won't go to court. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. Smotrich made comments yesterday. Ben-Gvir made comments. It's clear that they're being pressured by Netanyahu. Depends what Gallant gives, depends what Lapid gives. But the constitutional crisis means at the end of the day, if the Supreme Court strikes down the law and the government says, we do not think you have the authority to do that, it's actually not clear who runs the country.
Yeah. Dahlia, on this note, you alluded to the fact that the proposed reforms are pretty unpopular even within Israel. Would sticking to judicial reform actually be advantageous for Netanyahu, or is he being held hostage in some way by more extreme members of his party? Do you see signs that more moderate members of Likud might turn against him? What's happening internally there?
Well, it's an interesting question because for many years that I've been tracking this issue in general and in public opinion, what we see is that it is divisive within the right wing of the public. And that's why you see many moderate right wingers, or maybe even not so moderate right wingers, but people who are really, alienated by this reform out on the streets, or at least expressing their opposition to this reform as well. We really only have regularly about 20 to 30% of the Israeli public that agrees with various pieces of the reform, depending on how the question is being asked, but it almost never goes beyond that. And so he's losing part of his base. However, I'm very resistant to the idea of seeing Netanyahu as some sort of a victim of more extremist political forces, considering that Netanyahu himself is one of the main reasons why those political forces, are in government right now in terms of the religious Zionist formation, the list that ran together with that was an amalgam of parties like so many Israeli parties, but which includes Itamar Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudi, Jewish Power Party. These are basically Jewish supremacists, and Smotrich himself, which by the way is at least as bad as Ben-Gvir in terms of Jewish supremacy and really violent rhetoric and policies, to my mind, if not more. Netanyahu was the one who ensured that they would run together, that they would that they would both all cross the threshold, made them coalition partners, of course, because they didn't have that many options. But let's go back a little bit further. Netanyahu has presided over the remaking of the Likud in the image of this illiberal populist, vision for the country. And it's been going on pretty much since he got back into power in 2009. I remember in the term of the 18th Knesset from 2009 to 2013, the government led a series of illiberal legislation that was one of the reasons why activists began going to the Supreme Court regularly to begin with. And then the government in response started saying, oh, the Supreme Court is a terrible thing, and began trying to advance legislation to constrain the Supreme Court. All of that happened under Netanyahu's leadership, and many of those bills at the time, which were considered the most illiberal legislation Israel had seen in a long time, were co-sponsored by Likud figures. Some of them were co-sponsored by the current justice minister. Netanyahu has advanced and promoted these figures over the years, presiding over the defection of what we now call the liberal wing of the Likud, people who are very much committed to the Jabotinskyite and Begin kind of view that rule of law is, the main anchor of democracy, and independent judiciary is so important. So in the big picture, Netanyahu has a lot of responsibility for this. Now, is it really going to harm him one way or the other? I mean, right now we're seeing very, very minor forms of cracks inside the Likud. I mean, the other coalition partners are desperate to advance this legislation with strange sort of a little bit of ambiguity from the ultra-Orthodox parties, but ultimately they want it as well. And within the Likud, we've seen that Gallant, the defense minister took this position in March. He was basically slapped down by the threat of being fired. We all thought he was going to be fired, but then he wasn't actually fired. And since then, everybody else, as the Israelis say, as we say in Hebrew, have been as silent as fish, except for, rumblings. We've heard some voices saying, well, we will respect a Supreme Court ruling, Gallant being one of them, or we will only advance this legislation if it continues through consensus, which is another way of saying we don't support the unilateral advancing of this legislation. But so far, I have very little inclination that there would be 5 people who defect from the coalition over continuing the legislation. Okay, that's what you would need to bring this government down. Failing that, this government can continue, and I think Netanyahu is, typically very strategic, but also very spontaneous, playing it minute to minute, knowing he can get through any challenge. And I just think that he is essentially committed to moving ahead with this, even if it has to happen in tiny little increments, which is how Israeli policy has tended to work over the years, making changes through tiny little increments that eventually lead towards a bigger direction.
Daniel, do you have anything to add on this specifically? Otherwise, I'm happy to. I have lots more
questions.
Well,
I'll just, I think it's the first point where we might slightly disagree, which is good.
Great.
I mean,
yes, disagreement is good.
I don't really think Netanyahu cares about the judicial reform. In fact, I think that the core of Netanyahu, the deeply educated, widely read, thoughtful, we haven't seen signs of it in a long time, I grant you. But if it certainly was there, it may be there now. I think there's a very interesting other question about what's animating this with Netanyahu? Is it his own judicial woes? Are there many other issues? It may be that he's not well. It's not entirely clear that that is not the case, but we don't know. We'll know in 20, 30, 40 years. We don't know now. But I don't think he really actually is a fan of the judicial reform, certainly the way that it was proposed. He did it very clumsily. He did it very stupidly. The good chess player that he is would never have done this in the past this way. He has spoken in the past about the importance of an independent judiciary. So I agree with Dahlia. We don't have to feel sorry for him. We should not get out our violins and saying, oh, poor Bibi's been trapped by these big bad wolves. He brought the wolves right in for very cynical purposes. He deserves all of the flack that he's getting. And I think he deserves the other thing that he's getting, which is that his legacy is completely tarnished, which may be one of the reasons that he's so anxious to do the Saudi deal, but it's a separate issue. But I don't think that Bibi's actually so much in favor of the judicial thing. So I personally think that if he can figure out a way of staying in power and keeping some form of a coalition afloat without pushing judicial reform further, Smotrich doesn't really care all that much. He cares a little bit about it because of the West Bank, and Ben-Gvir also doesn't care. The people who care are Levin and Rothman. They will be outraged. But if Lapid or Gantz will give Bibi a lifeline, he might very well take it, because I think he's much less dogmatic and doctrinaire on the judicial reform thing. I think he's kind of gotten, again, I don't want to make him out to be a poor innocent victim. He's not, but he is being pulled by tides that are much stronger, I think, than he thought they were going to be.
Right. On this
Just one quick point on that.
Yeah.
One quick addition. I mean, I think that, I look a lot more at what Bibi says specifically since 2018-19, when he's been very, very on the front of this attack. And I also look at what he does. So I do think that I don't know if he is ideologically committed to it or not. I'm not going to disagree with you because I'm not inside his head. And he did used to defend the independent judiciary, but I will point out one thing. All the quotes that we see recurring in the Israeli media, when people love to point out how supportive he was, they all go back to 1 week in 2012, 2 weeks in 2012. That's over a decade ago. And I think that he is all for having greater power for the executive and for himself. And if it has to happen in tiny little invisible increments, he's fine with that too. So I agree that he doesn't necessarily need to be ideologically committed to these big, dramatic, splashy judicial reform packages that have been proposed, but I think he's perfectly in favor of consolidating power.
So, Daniel, last week you had a really interesting conversation with Mati Friedman and Yossi Klein Halevi, two other, I would say, centrist figures who have been very outspoken, in particularly getting American Jews to care about this issue. And Mati said something interesting in that conversation that stood out to me, that we're kind of missing the broader issue here. It's really about the rise in the power of the Israeli extreme right in some ways, and that they are just using judicial overhaul as a tool to advance more extreme elements of their vision of Israel. Do you think that is on the money? Are we focusing on the wrong thing here, or are there other nuances that you would add there?
Well, there's no wrong thing to focus on. I mean, this is a multifaceted diamond, and every time you hold it up to the light, you see a kind of a different refraction. This is about a huge split in Israeli society that is unprecedented. This is about the greatest single crisis that the country has ever faced. And it's also one that's brought in by its own actions, not by somebody from the outside. It's about the question of whether or not the Mizrahim are really Ezrachim Sug Bet, class 2 citizens. And there's a huge debate about whether or not that's really an issue here. It's very, very complicated. There's a lot of issues here. So you can't, almost by definition, be focusing on the wrong thing. They're all important and they all matter. And the implications of this are going to get worked out over the course of the coming years. Look, obviously, Mati is crazy smart and a good friend. And yes, on the surface, it looks very much like the rise of not the right only, that's a separate issue, but the radical fringe right. The radical fringe right being supremacist Jewishly, violently racist, in favor of all sorts of steps against, by the way, first Palestinian Arabs, but I'm convinced eventually Israeli Arabs as well. So when Ben-Gvir is in the studio and he gives this whole long harangue about Palestinians on the West Bank, and there's an Israeli Arab journalist whose first name happens to be Muhammad sitting in the studio, and Ben-Gvir goes, "Oh, slicha, Muhammad, like, I hope you aren't upset that I said all these nasty things about the Palestinians." That disgusting little smirk that he had when he said that meant, by the way, we're going to get them first, but we're going to get you. So I think that Israeli Arabs have very grave reason to be nervous here. But here's so Mati's right. There is a rise of the far right. But here's what I think is, I'm not saying he's wrong, but there's reason for optimism also. I know a number of people, mostly friends of mine, and we're talking about their parents, who are lifelong Likud voters who voted for Ben Gvir this time. They live mostly in the Negev. They are tired of the situation of the Bedouins and violence and stealing. And Ben Gvir ran on a very smart platform. His sign on all the buses said, Mi po baal habayit. Who runs this place? And that was their way of saying government after government, left and right, Bennett, Lapid, Bibi, they all basically ignored this problem, and they really did. And they finally said, look, I'm just going to vote for the guy that's going to fix this problem. And if you talk to those people now, they say, oh my God, I made a huge mistake. I didn't realize these guys were as insane as they are. I think they picked something off the shelf, bought it, and then find out that it doesn't taste anything like what they thought they were getting. So there's a way in which we have a lot of reason to be very concerned about the Jewish supremacist, racist, violent right. It's all of those things and worse. But there is a way in which they may have done themselves some very significant damage also. And that just remains to be seen. A lot of them may revert back to the Likud. There were Likud voters who voted Ben Gvir this time because they were sick of the Likud not taking care of whatever the issue is. And they may revert back to the Likud. There are people who voted Likud this time who are saying, that's it, I'm still a right-wing person, but this is just out of proportion. And they'll probably vote Bennett or Lapid, or if Bennett runs again, and so forth. So there's a lot of shifting here. The polls are showing that the country actually in the last few months has moved to the left or away from the right and more towards the center. There's a huge difference between ranking in the polls and winning in an election. And Gantz has a unique talent for ranking well in the polls and then losing elections. It's very, very early to say what'll be. So I would say, yes, Mati's right. There is reason to be very concerned about the far left, far right religious extremist nationalist flank. But there may also be some reason for a certain amount of optimism that Israelis got a very rude wake-up call, and some of them are going to rethink what the Jewishness of this state should actually mean.
Can I add to that as well?
Please.
At the expense of other questions. Sorry, I don't really disagree. I would just take it a little further. I think that it's not so much that it's really about the far right wing. I think that it's the far right wing in a way is a bit of a sideshow or an outgrowth of deeper problems in Israeli society. So I would almost say the opposite. I would say the real problem is Israel's profound lack of democratic foundations. Israel declined to pass that constitution in the earliest years. Israel has declined to anchor equality of all citizens in any law, not just a basic law, any law. Israel doesn't have
including the
checks
Barak
and
government, by
balances.
the way. The Barak court also
course.
declined to.
Absolutely. And Israel has never defined its borders. And all of these things contribute to the fact that Israel can rule over people without any sort of anchor for human rights. And I don't mean the Palestinians. I mean Israeli citizens who only have 2 basic laws out of what was originally a package of 4 basic laws. And that means we're missing, and never mind that was whittled down from much more robust Bill of Rights drafts over the years. But what I want to point out, this leads to my second just additional point, is that I couldn't agree more that this government is on the warpath against both Palestinians, of course, but Palestinian and Arab citizens of Israel. I've written about this. There's a whole slew of horrible bills that, some of them are kind of gimmicks and maybe not advancing, but they all indicate where this government is going in ways that essentially attack the position of Arab citizens of Israel. But let's face it, a country that has not grounded and anchored in any constitutional law, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion for that matter, or the supremacy of its constitutional norms, leaves every single citizen vulnerable. And that is what this government wants to exploit. That's why we had a former Supreme Court justice who wrote an article, which is, I haven't read yet because it was just published, but I saw the headline and I couldn't agree more. That's a government only passes a law striking down the reasonability basis if it plans to act with extreme unreasonability.
That's true.
So switching gears a little bit to try to get into the mindset of folks who are pro judicial overhaul, I think the most common argument I've heard from the pro overhaul camp is that most Israelis, or many Israelis, have for some time felt like the court is a bit overly interventionist and that some degree of court reform is needed. From each of your perspectives, what is the best argument for the proposed reforms, overhaul, coup, however you would like to phrase it, and what would your response be? Not to set up a straw man, but how do you really grapple with what the other side brings up in this conversation?
Well, was I supposed to go? I don't know who's supposed
Either
to
one
go.
of you.
Okay. Look, there is room for judicial reform in Israel, and I would argue that actually that there is need for judicial reform. People like Yedidia Stern, who I think are very smart jurisprudential scholars who are kind of in the middle, argue that it's not only okay to have some judicial reform, it's long overdue to have some judicial reform. We don't have time here now to unpack all of the ways in which the activist Aaron Barak court was really very activist. It's just way complicated, and there's tons of stuff online people can read, and there's very sophisticated stuff people should be reading. But I think I would distinguish between the Israelis who are in favor of it and the Americans who are in favor of it, because the Americans who are in favor of it are actually applying a different model to this, and I'll come back to it in a second. So the Israelis are right. Look, a large part of this, and this really needs to be understood, a large part of this has its roots in 2005. 2005 is when Israel gets out of Gaza. 2005 is 18 years ago, when people like Ben Gvir, like Smotrich, like Rothman, like Levin are all coming of age politically. These are guys who are in their 40s. Back then, they were young men in their late teens, early 20s. And what did they see? They saw that there were these the thousands of Israelis in Gaza. Ariel Sharon ran for office saying that he wasn't going to do anything about that, or whatever, didn't indicate it. He got to office. He switched completely 180 degrees. We're getting out of Gaza. People said, bring it to some sort of a vote. He said, absolutely not. We're not doing this. A lot of people appealed to the court. Many people appealed to the Supreme Court, asking the Supreme Court to intervene, and the Supreme Court did not hear those cases. Now, again, I am not in favor of the judicial overhaul. That's pretty obvious. And I'm not a right-winger on this particular issue, but I just want to, in the voice of someone, my students at Shalem, who some of them, a few, were the children of families that were kicked out of Gaza in 2005. Now, I don't think that our students feel exactly what I'm about to say, but I know people that do. And they say, look, in 2005, we were the cutting edge of Zionism. My parents moved into Gaza when there was nothing there. We built not huge, but we built beautiful communities and synagogues and, frankly, cemeteries with my parents' other children and my parents' parents. And we voted for Sharon, and he switched, and everybody said, at least bring it to some sort of vote. He said no. He pulled out. Many of us appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court wouldn't hear it. And they said, and basically, you know what we did? We left. And did all the people that are on the right in Israel take to the streets? Did they block the highways? Did they start quitting the army? They didn't. They were opposed to it, but they didn't do that. And they say, and coupled to that, that in Sheikh Jarrah, there's a small number of houses, the contested nature of which comes up every few years in the Supreme Court. And they say tens of thousands of Israelis were kicked out of Gaza, and the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it once. And these few houses in Sheikh Jarrah that are home to half a dozen families, et cetera, they're saying, where's our voice being heard? Now this is payback. Now, again, I'm not in favor of the overhaul. I'm not in favor of the coup, but I do understand the pain of people who feel that their voice wasn't heard. And that's why I think we're in very dangerous territory here. A lot of what's happened here is very bad in terms of precedent. I actually am very empathetic with the pilots who have decided not to fly. I know a bunch of them. I know how heartbroken they are about the decision, but I also understand the people who say, so what? If Israel makes a deal with Saudi Arabia and we have to pull out of certain parts of the West Bank to do that, all of a sudden the soldiers on the right are going to say, well, I'm not participating in that. I mean, you can't have a country that works that way. So there's a lot to say here on all the different sides, and we don't have time really to give rise to, give fair expression to all of these issues. Let me say something about what the agenda of many people here is, and a problem that the right finds itself facing now, and then I'll pass it on to Dahlia. Everybody has an agenda here, and the agendas are not the same. Ben Gvir and Rothman and the Haredim and Bibi all have different agendas. They coalesce in wanting to push through the judicial reform or judicial coup, depending on who you ask. Their agendas are different. The Haredim have one agenda only. basically. And it is to get a basic law passed that their young men do not have to serve in the army. And then it won't be up to each government. It'll be part of the constitutional nature of the state of Israel. It puts the right-wing parties in Israel in a very, very problematic situation for them to be party to be passing a law that 11% of the population won't serve in the army. It's the most anti-Zionist thing in the world. So for people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are hyper-Zionists, to sign on to that, that's a huge problem for them. And that makes a huge problem for Bibi. The Haredim have that agenda. Smotrich wants to basically take over the West Bank and turn it into, parts of it at least, into free of Arab rule, free from any Arab presence, and do all sorts of things that I find, anathema, but that's his agenda. Ben-Gvir, I think, has a kind of a violent attitude and a violent intention with Arabs in the West Bank and probably Arabs inside Israel later on as well. And Bibi may have a judicial agenda in terms of keeping himself, from being convicted and imprisoned as long as he's prime minister. So there are lots of reasons to be opposed to this, but there have been cases, for example, Dahlia mentioned that the reasonability thing is about administrative law, which is 1,000% true. There was a case, for example, not a few years ago, when the government budget did not call for providing shelters within 7 kilometers of the Gaza border. People in Gaza, and the Otef Aza, that the Jewish settlements around Gaza appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court actually ruled in their favor, and it said to the government, you have to actually build shelters there within, I think it was a 7-mile or 9-mile radius belt, whatever it was. The government said that's stupid use of money. Supreme Court said, we don't care. They deserve the protection. What happened? I think that several billion shekels were spent on building those shelters. And within a couple of years, Hamas had just increased the range of its rockets, so the shelters made no difference anymore. Now, scholars at, for example, Hebrew University Law School have said that's the example when the Supreme Court doesn't actually have the expertise to make those kinds of decisions. So they have the expertise to know that Aryeh Deri should not be prime minister, to be finance minister. It's pretty obvious if you've been convicted twice of fraud, you shouldn't be in charge of the finances of the country. But there are other cases that people point to that say the Supreme Court has overstepped at times. And so I think in all of these issues, there is room for at what point could the Supreme Court say that it has the right to judicial review? In what specific instances should the court have the opportunity or the option of using the reasonability clause and whatnot? Could you change the rules of the committee that appoints judges, even without changing the nature of the committee, just to require, let's say, 7 votes in favor of a judge that would give everybody a veto instead of just the judiciary a veto? There's room to tinker here and make things, I think, a little bit more fair, a little bit more reasonable. But like many things in life, there are also times when you try to fix something, and either you're not trying to fix what you say you're trying to fix, or your fix is just too much and you actually create a different problem. This is one of those two things. Either the fix is too much, or the agenda was never the fix, as Dahlia intimated in the first place. There's room for reform, just not this reform.
Yeah, if I can add to that for a second. I mean, I just want to recall that about a week ago, I was having a conversation with a lawyer and we were disagreeing on it because this particular friend sort of supported the idea of reform, even if not this particular reform. And I said, and when I asked why, all the usual things came up. There's not enough diversity in the court, and the court is too open to interpretation, and we need to have different kinds of justices who aren't all from the same clique, and things like that. And I said, well, I want to hear from lawyers. So we decided to send out a kind of call for a bunch of regular lawyers, mostly from the North, anonymously. We said it was for possibly an article that I'll write. And I got back a bunch of answers within 24 hours. About 50 different lawyers wrote all of their wish list of what kinds of reforms should happen to the judiciary. And I think one of them mentioned anything to do with the reforms going on now. All of them had to do with ways to cut down the lengthy waiting times due to absolute overworking, overbooked schedules of the justices, because there aren't enough justices, partly because there are too many vacancies. All sorts of very detailed things that had nothing to do with the reform we're looking at now. So I absolutely support judicial reform in ways that serve the citizens. And I don't see anything here that serves the citizens or even actually advances some of the changes this government has argued it needs. For example, diversification of justices, including Mizrahi justices. All of that is commendable, except that they're largely built on inaccuracies. There have been Mizrahi justices. There are other underrepresented populations, and nothing in the reform is designed to change that. The other thing I would point out is, so there's a difference between constitutional judicial reform and reform of the Israeli judiciary, which I think the latter is much more urgent right now. Another thing I think is worth saying is that, the image, again, that the Supreme Court has been against the settlers and against the right wing, or specifically when it comes to issues of occupation and, the fate of the West Bank and Gaza. That's also, you can take it back to 2005, which absolutely, you're correct, it was a complete rupture in Israeli society. We're still living with the consequences. But you could also go much further back. You can go back to, if you're looking specifically at occupation-related policy, go back to 1979, when the court first ruled that the Israeli government cannot build settlements, civilian settlements, on private land. For the settlers, this was a huge blow. But everybody
Privately
forgot
owned
that in the middle,
Palestinian land, just to make clear,
on private Palestinian land, of course, yes,
right.
in the West Bank. Now, everybody forgot that in between, there was a ruling that completely threw out the case brought by Peace Now, trying to challenge the settlement project, in which the court ruled it was simply not justiciable, and has basically given, by taking itself up, by recusing itself from the issue, has essentially let the government build, maybe 90% of the settlements that are there today are not challenged, or cannot be challenged by the court, and vast other areas of policy with relation to the occupation. It's not just about constructing settlements, it's about everything else that goes on. And when you're, using the army to manage a civilian population, to rule a civilian population all these years, all of that stuff is very well known by the tiny core of people who focus on issues of law and the Supreme Court and occupation policy, but the vast majority of Israelis have been told by their government and other, influential voices for years that the Supreme Court is somehow against the settlements, which is basically wrong. Now, in terms of the, as you point out, Daniel, very well, I won't go over everything. Everybody has a slightly different agenda. These forces are converging now. I would just make the point that it's not just about these current figures. They all represent very long-term communities and streams within Israeli life, and they are coming to fruition now because of those vulnerabilities in the Israeli system to begin with. That would be my argument. And there's lots of wonderful writing about this. Maybe the time to advertise my new book, which is a history of democracy in Israel from Herzl to yesterday, coming out September 18th.
If it's the future of democracy, it might be a short book, but hopefully not. But
I can't tell you how many people have made that joke, but it's mostly
right,
history, which means I didn't have to do too much rewriting in 2023.
There you go. I just want to highlight what Dahlia said, because it's critically important. The notion that the Supreme Court, because I agree with her here, I think Dahlia and I do not entirely agree about Israeli issues in the West Bank, but that's a whole other conversation. But the idea that the Supreme Court has been hostile to the occupation is ludicrous. The Supreme Court has actually been very supportive of the settlement project. You can like that or not like that, depending on whatever you think. But the only way in which the Supreme Court, as Dahlia said, had laid down the law is that you cannot build settlements on privately held Palestinian land. And that,
even though it happens anyway.
Yeah, but that's a separate issue. That's a separate, that's whatever.
Our next seminar, yes.
My point is only that if you are pro rapid building of settlements, that is the biggest obstacle now to your building and expanding settlements, is the issue of privately held Palestinian land. And I believe that part of what is animating Smotrich and Ben-Gvir is they want to defang the court, because they want to actually change the law and make it permissible for Israelis to usurp privately held Palestinian land. Now, if you are in favor of that, then you should be applauding this judicial reform, because that's probably what you would get if the court was defanged. But if you are in favor of judicial reform because you think it's a healthy thing and whatever, but you certainly wouldn't want to build on privately held Palestinian land, you have to be very, very careful here, because one would very much likely lead to the other. Dahlia and I are just very much agreeing. I just want to again say that I think that this notion, as she said, that the court has been opposed to the settlement project is just completely wrong. It's been very supportive of the settlement project over the years, with that one exception.
Dahlia, it's amazing how you can disagree on your opinions, but agree on the facts.
A lost value here, I think, a lot. Dahlia, I want to turn back to you. You've, I should have said prolific advisor to campaigns in Israel. I think you've advised 8 national campaigns.
9. It goes up every year. Yeah.
You need to tell folks to update your bio elsewhere. But in any event,
I know, I can't keep up.
Netanyahu is coming to the US next week for the first time since returning to office in December. And from where I sit, it seems like one of his worst ideas in a while. Biden will only meet with him on the sidelines of the UNGA. He hasn't been invited to the White House. He has perhaps never been more deeply unpopular among American Jews. Why is he coming? What's the logic in something like this now?
Well, remember, one of Netanyahu's really his only positive selling point at this point, and actually I would argue that going a couple of election cycles back, I think I wrote an article about this back in 2019 at some point, that he has no positive campaign. The only positive campaign he has, as opposed to being divisive and saying, oh, lefties and Palestinians are traitors, the only positive campaign he's had for a long time is what a great foreign policy leader he is. So you're right that it's not going to look great for him if he didn't get that White House invitation that he promised us was coming, quite a while ago. But trust me, whatever, if he winks at Biden as they pass each other in the hall, he will sell it at home as an enormous victory. He will say our relationship has never been better. And, his hardcore supporters that's enough for them. And I think that we have to remember that he would never skip an international forum that allows that, photo op of him on the stage giving this speech looking like a statesman. It's one of the areas where, frankly, he towers over pretty much everybody else in Israel. As Daniel also very correctly pointed out in the beginning, he is, I would say, the most savvy statesman with the broadest reach, interest, and knowledge about global politics, about global trends, about the dynamics in other countries, which is why I also say it's no accident that he's been cultivating so many undemocratic countries over the last number of years, including, by the way, the Abraham Accords. I mean, we all are happy that there's normalization in the Middle East, but let's not forget that this follows on the heels of very well-established relationships that Netanyahu has been cultivating for a number of years before that with some of the world's worst dictatorships, from Azerbaijan to the illiberal and ultranationalist leadership of Narendra Modi, and who's presiding over India's democratic decline, never mind campaigning on his relationship with Vladimir Putin. So he wouldn't miss the opportunity to be on a global stage. But I think we also need to be clear-eyed about where Netanyahu sees Israel in the family of nations, and it's not necessarily with the Western liberal democratic nations.
Laura, can I just add to that? I think your question is really, really important. I actually agree with the premise of your question, with this. Bibi is gambling here, and it may end up being a very, very bad gamble. He's feeling very caged in Israel. There's nowhere he can go here where the protesters don't hound him. He and his family went on vacation up north. They found the place where he was staying, and they toot their horns, and they, whatever. I mean, I'm saying they, it's also me, but whatever. I wasn't at that particular protest, but there's a whole, those of us who are on these WhatsApp lists, we get these WhatsApps all day long. So-and-so, such and such a minister is moving from place X to place Y. They're going to be in place Y in 20 minutes. We need 30 protesters. I mean, it's unbelievably orchestrated, and it's going to be that orchestrated in New York as well. So if he thinks he's getting out of here to escape some of that, I think he's in for a very rude awakening. This group called Unacceptable is very sophisticated. They've gotten a lot of people out on the streets, and they'll do it again. But I think he's going largely because he feels he has no place to turn here. Bibi is giving interviews to the foreign press, but not at all to the Israeli press, because nobody in Israel believes anything he says. There are still many journalists in the foreign press, because he's got this, presence and so forth, who still kind of believe some of the things that he says. So I think he just needs the oxygen. Which I think that's why he's going. But I think, in keeping with the premise of your question, it may look really, really bad if he goes to New York and is there also met by thousands of anti-Bibi Israeli protesters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess we will see soon. I've been integrating the questions in the chat into our conversation, but there's one I want to read from, and Daniel, I feel like you're probably best positioned to answer it because you've written a lot about this, but we have a question from Ruti, who says, I see myself as center-right. I don't feel comfortable with Ben Gvir or Smotrich. I want my Palestinian neighbors to be treated with respect. The one thing I can't get past is having my home in Judea referred to as the West Bank and occupied territory. When do we get past labels that are only hurtful? And will we ever get to working toward accepting all of Israel and figuring out how to solve the problems within our country as if it were our country?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but here's what I'll say. That nomenclature in Israel is very problematic. Every book that I write, I have to put a footnote in saying I'm saying West Bank, not to take a political stand. I'm just kind of use the terminology of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and NBC and ABC, whatever, CNN, Fox. They all call it the West Bank. Fox does not call it Judea and Samaria. And if you call it Judea and Samaria, then your average American Jewish reader thinks of you as a kind of a right-wing person, and they assume something about the book. Look, right now, do you call it judicial reform or do you call it judicial coup? And again, is it an occupation? Is it legally an occupation? Look, at the end of the day, Israeli soldiers are in the lives of Palestinians who live in that area that Israel captured in 1967. They are not independent. They don't have their own passports. You can argue whether it's an occupation, but Israel is a huge presence in their life and not a positive one mostly. And so when I say West Bank, I'm not trying to align myself with a position about the settlements or not. When I say occupation, I'm not trying to say something that should end or something that should go on. It's just the presence of Israel in the West Bank. I think Ruthie's right that the nomenclature is very sensitive, but there's no nomenclature that's not sensitive. If you use the opposite nomenclature, then you step on somebody else's toes. And so, but I have to the only question that I would ask Ruthie, she can write me separately, is if you are opposed to Ben Gvir and you're opposed to Smotrich and you want your Palestinian neighbors to be treated with respect and so forth, what exactly is right wing about that? But it may be much more centrist than you suspect, in which case you and I are perfectly aligned, but we'll talk about that in person over coffee sometime.
I'm very sympathetic to Ruthie, actually. I think that people can be right wing and hold those kinds of views. And I think that I don't expect anybody to change their political self-identity. I would just say that when you ask about labels that are hurtful, the question is who they're hurtful towards. And when I look at this region, I try to take into account everybody between the river and the sea, because my country controls everybody between the river and the sea. So it's true that I use the West Bank because I think it is a more generally understood term. It's not just that people will look at you as far right if you say Judea and Samaria, but a lot of the audiences abroad won't even know what we're talking about. Right. But more than that, I often find myself using all the labels. I say Judea, Samaria, and the West Bank. I say Palestinian citizens of Israel and Arab citizens of Israel. I mean, it's very awkward, but I think that as long as it's my country controlling the whole thing, and let's be honest, it is. And some of those people are living under a military regime. There is no such thing as Israel gave back. Palestinians are not self-governing. They don't have self-determination. They don't have anything like civil or representative government. And so I have to take everyone into account. And I agree that it would be better if we had a system in which all the people controlled by one regime, which is currently the status of the land, would have equal rights. And if we don't want that, then we shouldn't be controlling.
I have one more question for Dahlia. I mean, I have a million more questions for both of you, but I'm going to stick to one more question for Dahlia, and then one, I guess, a little more forward-looking for both of you to answer quickly as we wrap up. But something that's been kind of interesting to me when looking at these protests and thinking about the future is there doesn't really seem to be like one or two charismatic leaders that have emerged in the same way that you would really need to convert critical mass of protests into a long-term political movement. And it seems like one of the things that might be contributing to that is that in some senses, it's good to be focused just exclusively on judicial reform. But as a lot of American Jews have pointed out, and I think is becoming more of a conversation than a whisper in Israel as well, is that talking about the occupation is really a non-starter, or at least was at the beginning of these protests. Dahlia, from where you sit, do you see that shifting as to people's willingness to tie this into other issues within Israel? And do you think that will help or undermine the critical mass and the future of this movement?
I really want to leave time for Daniel to answer a question too, and that is so huge. But I did just write a big article about how I was looking at all of the pictures I took from January to now, and yes, I have gone to every single demonstration if I've been in the country. And the creativity and breadth of people's hand-lettered signs is astonishing. People are bringing in a whole range of issues, from anti-occupation stuff to LGBT rights to social democratic and the welfare state issues, and lots of religious imagery, by the way. This is anything but an anti-religious protest. I mean, it's amazing. People want separation of religion and state, but lots of people quoting from the Bible and using that as part of their claims. So everything is there. I think it's, in a way, exciting that there's so much that Israelis are having this awakening where they're realizing how many things are connected. Kind of, I'm calling it like Israel's version of intersectionality. But I do think that there is, on the other hand, eventually, there's going to need to be a convergence around what needs to happen as the ground level, the infrastructure for advancing those things. And that will go back to those democratic foundations that are missing. And I do think, that without acknowledging that Israel's most undemocratic project, Israel's most enduring undemocratic project, is the policy of occupation. I'm not even talking about whether this is a legal definition in international terms. I just mean the fact that there are people being governed by military law or through the military, even under a hodgepodge of incomprehensible laws under an unrepresentative government for, over 50 years. Let's not forget that for the first 20 years before that, we also had citizens governed under military rule. So Israel has normalized an fundamentally undemocratic practice throughout its history. And until we open that up, I don't think we'll be able to understand why we need the kinds of foundations we need in order to advance that hodgepodge of issues. I'll leave the leadership question aside for now because it's just too big, but in a way, I think it's good that people are just focusing on the issues without worrying about getting elected in the next elections, although they are worrying about it. I think it's a mistake. I think that ultimately Israel is not on course for the democracy camp to win the next elections if they're held very soon, because people haven't made that shift quite yet. All the polls are showing this government losing, but I don't see people really reshifting to support like left-wing or centrist parties. And I think it's fool's gold. They need to, commit to building democratic principles before we start worrying about winning elections and think long-term. Israel has, fatal flaw, always making short-term policy. And, it's not going to help if you really want to build democracy from the ground up.
So final question for today. I know folks have so many more, and I do as well, but if you could both answer briefly, we can start with Daniel. Also, if you have anything to add on what Dahlia just said, but what are the biggest open questions you have watching tomorrow's hearing? And then as a practical thing for readers, what are some news sources that folks might not be familiar with, whether individuals or outlets in English or Hebrew or otherwise, that you follow for latest developments and insights on this stuff?
Well, in terms of the first part, tomorrow we're just going to hear arguments. We're not going to get a decision tomorrow. My hope is that the Supreme Court will neither strike down the law nor accept it, but look for a middle of the road way out. My great fear is that half the country is going to be disenfranchised if the court doesn't do that. If the court strikes down the law, then all those people who voted for the coalition, they had a legal right to vote for the government, and the government won. I mean, nobody's saying the election wasn't fair. They'll say then we got no legislative bang for our voter buck. The system is fundamentally broken. It will make those people feel even more disenfranchised. Whereas if the Supreme Court accepts the law change and kind of says, okay, you can have that tool from our toolbox, we didn't need it anyway, I think all those people out on the streets will say, as Yedidya Stern has been saying, Hamivtzar nafal. The fortress has collapsed. In other words, even the Supreme Court is being party to overrunning democracy or not standing up, and that will create a tremendous sense of disenfranchisement and worry and fear. So my hope is that if the court ends up ruling, and there's not, because it might not if there is a compromise reached before, that it'll find some middle of the way, send it back to the Knesset for revision, send it back for procedural correction, argue that it does have the right to review basic laws, but it's choosing not to view this one because of whatever. Find something that leaves everybody a little bit happy and a little bit unhappy. I will say one thing about where we're going forward from here, and then what sources. Look, it's been a very tragic, sad, frightening time since November 1st when we had the election, and I think many of us have literally lost sleep and have been very, very worried. But there's also been an outpouring of caring about this country, and there's been an outpouring, as we said earlier in our conversation, about people waking up. So it's possible this is going to be the beginning of something very powerful and important also, at which point converting this into political power will matter, probably long before we get the constitutional issues resolved. But there's a lot to be very proud of, and I think very hopeful for here. And especially going into Rosh Hashanah, I think that's what we have to focus on. There's a lot of love of this country. And even if you just take a step back, the left and the right are both holding the Israeli flag as the symbol of their protest. That in itself is an extraordinary thing. The protesters in Portland and Seattle were not holding American flags. There's just something very powerful about this being about the love of this project. We have a lot of educational work to do. We have a lot of work to do on democracy. Everything that Dahlia said on that front, I agree with. Look, the resources are sort of obvious. One thing that I think needs to be said, if you buy one Hebrew newspaper during the weekend, you buy Haaretz, or you buy Yediot, or you buy Makor Rishon, there is more material in that one newspaper on Friday than in all of the Israeli covering English press put together, by far, just by far. That's not a criticism of anybody. It's just to say that but not having access to the Hebrew press is a great limitation, and there's not anybody can do about it right now. But it's just so the obvious ones, obviously the Forward, obviously Times of Israel, obviously JPost, obviously haaretz.com. Dahlia runs 972 or founded 972. Mine is my personal blog podcast, which is called Israel from the Inside, is meant to try to give a variety of different perspectives, not only mine. So there are things that are out there, but what I would urge people to do is to read the sophisticated stuff, not the 3-column newspaper article, but the really sophisticated things that are long essays about issues having to do with jurisprudential change in Israel. Neta Barak Koren, you can Google her. She's a professor of law at Hebrew University, unbelievably bright, smart, knowledgeable, has written a couple of very important papers about this. There's also the IDI, the Israel Democracy Institute website, which is very good. The Jewish People Policy Institute, which is now run by Yedidia Stern, has been putting out some very good material. There's a lot of stuff out there. It doesn't take too much digging, and it's worth really going beyond the most obvious first steps.
Thank you, Dahlia.
Okay, I'm trying to think about the first part of the question.
Just the biggest. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, the things that I'm concerned about, let me just say the main thing I'm concerned about for the Supreme Court. Daniel's right. We don't even know when the decisions are going to be released. Probably they have to release it up until January. But I think that my biggest concern is that it's very hard for me to escape the feeling that the court cannot rule in a supportive environment. And I say supportive because I don't think there's such a thing as a neutral environment. I don't believe the law is truly separate from politics or society. But the absolutely explicit threats coming from the government and anger from the protesters. Let's be fair. The protesters are panicking, angry. I'm one of them. But I mean, there is a very, very supercharged environment. And I can't imagine how the court can simply weigh legal arguments in a kind of environment that you would expect when it has to deal with such sensitive issues. So that's really big on my mind. I don't think there's any one way to resolve that. Let me cut right to the sources because I think I've said everything I need to say in terms of the long-term analysis. In terms of sources, I agree. The Israel Democracy Institute is a gold mine of information. There is pretty much no issue that has been untouched in their resources. A lot of this requires Hebrew, but a lot of their stuff is in English as well. I would
add, of data too. Yeah, a
lot of data as well. I would add that there's amazing number of civil society groups that have sprung up, or organizations or constellations. One of the most important ones, again, mostly for Hebrew readers, but not only, they've translated some stuff, is the Law Professors Forum for Democracy, which is a group of scholars who just got together and said, we have to put out material about this. Very accessible, short briefings. Some of them are translated into English, extremely useful. I can name some of the individuals I think are the best, but you can find them. Everything written by former Supreme Court justices has been very helpful. There's not only the article in Haaretz today by Ayala Prokatya, one of the former Supreme Court justices, but everything Yitzhak Zamir writes, I just devour because he's one of the really smartest, most experienced voices in this country. And I would say one thing that may surprise you all, and that is read Israel Hayom, read Israel Today. The reason is you cannot understand this debate if you're going to divorce yourself from how the Israeli public thinks about it. Plus, Israel Hayom is not what it was when its grandpapa was alive. Right. Okay, there has been all sorts of changes in Israel Hayom, and it is a rather diverse forum now for voices that I think are very representative of mainstream Israeli society, from certainly leaning right, but also leaning centrist and sometimes interesting back and forth. Yeah, I can't take credit for running 972 anymore because I've really been out of the site since about 2019, although I do have an article coming out soon, but I do write regularly at Haaretz in English right now, and other places in English. So if you want to read my more recent writing from recent years, it's there. And yeah, I just would say read everything pretty much.
Thank you both so much. I always learn so much and have so much to think about after speaking with either of you. And for folks listening, thank you so much. I will spend time posting links to what Daniel and Dahlia referenced, and you can always go to forward.com/tag/Israel to see everything we're covering, not only on judicial overhaul, but on the country that houses half of the world's Jewish population. And both so much for all of your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.